Jordan Price had never intended to be anyone's symbol of defiance, especially not in the sleepy neighborhood where property lines were more sacred than holidays, and where smiling at the wrong time of day could be interpreted as suspicious behavior. He had come to live in this house not because he wanted peace, but because it was quiet enough to think. The two-story brick home, inherited from an eccentric uncle who collected analog radios and refused to ever use a smartphone, was perched at the edge of a slowly modernizing community, one where mailboxes were now smart, fences had sensors, and even. The dog walkers wore QR-coded armbands linked to a community app. Jordan didn't participate in any of that. He kept to himself, not because he disliked people, but because he had learned over time that solitude was far less taxing than explaining to strangers why he valued things that didn't blink, beep, or track. The incident started not with drama, but with the wind. A fierce storm rolled through the state, toppling utility lines like matchsticks and plunging entire zones into blackout. Jordan, anticipating such a failure from years of observing the increasingly fragile infrastructure of the region, had pulled his old diesel generator out of storage the day before. It had belonged to his uncle, and, like most of the man's gadgets, it was old but functional, loud but reliable. When the grid went dark, Jordan's house didn't. Light flooded his kitchen as he lit the gas stove, brewed coffee, and went about assembling an order of custom components for a client who required them shipped to Kentucky within the week. The rest of the block remained in darkness, a silent grid of nervous windows and flickering battery-powered candles. He knew someone would take issue with that. It was inevitable. By the third night of generator operation, he received the first notice. Not by a knock on the door or a personal call. Those would have required interaction, accountability, maybe even dialogue, but through an unmarked envelope placed precisely in the center of his doormat, as if to signal that someone had walked up, paused, and made a decision. The paper inside was sleek, laser-printed, topped with an embossed logo that mimicked a compass but pointed only inward. Notice of violation. Sound intrusion, level 2. It read, "Your use of unregulated mechanical power sources during a neighborhood-wide outage is in conflict with Article 17 of the Community Integration Policy. This serves as formal notice to cease operations within 48 hours or risk penalty assessment." There was no name, no contact, just a QR code and a file number. Jordan stared at it for a full minute, not angry, not amused, simply observing, mentally marking the start of something he hadn't yet named but already recognized as escalation. Rather than react, he recorded, not the video kind. He wasn't a man for social media outrage or 20-minute rants about injustice. He began documenting every hour of generator use, tracking decibel levels, fuel consumption, output stability. He ordered a calibrated sound meter and placed it at the edge of his property. He took still photos of the generator, untouched, tucked behind a sound-dampening barrier of concrete tiles he'd installed to reduce echo. He logged the weather, the wind speed, and the times at which the generator was most active. It wasn't paranoia. It was preemptive self-defense. Experience had taught him that in conflicts involving silence and power, it was always the quiet ones who needed the strongest record. The next week brought two things: an abrupt halt to neighborhood blackouts as the utility company restored power, and the arrival of a second notice, this time citing him for disruption of harmonized auditory space. He laughed at the phrase. It was elegant, sterile, and frightening in the way all corporate euphemisms were. Attached was a digital sound graph with bright red spikes, ostensibly representing noise complaints logged by neighbors. Still no names, no real evidence, just numbers, plotted and weaponized. That was when the water slowed to a trickle. His utility account showed no issues. Bills were paid. But the pressure in his taps had dropped by 70%, and the customer service representative could only offer to submit a local inspection request. Meanwhile, his mobile internet, delivered through a private tower on the hill, began to buffer and lag during upload windows, odd for a private node. He checked diagnostics, pinged nearby sources, rerouted through alternate IP tunnels, and saw a delay he couldn't trace. Someone was tampering. Not directly, not illegally. Not yet. But with plausible deniability, wrapped in policies and layers of sub-authority. It was on the 4th day of this slow attrition that Karen arrived. He recognized her by the walk, upright, brisk, but slightly theatrical, the kind of gait that announced, "I belong here," a full 10 feet before arrival. She wore the uniform of neighborhood involvement, sun visor, tablet bag, and shoes that never touched actual grass. Her voice was pleasant, falsely surprised. "Oh, I didn't realize you were home," she said, glancing meaningfully at the side of the house where the turbine now stood. Jordan nodded, but said nothing. She continued anyway. "I just wanted to gently raise a concern. A few of us were talking during the recent blackout and, well, your generator was quite loud." He didn't respond. The turbine behind his house, installed just 2 days ago, made no sound. It wasn't even operational yet. Karen gestured vaguely toward the windless sky. "Now, I see you've got something new up. Quite innovative looking. I hope it's compliant." Jordan stared. "With what exactly?" "Oh, you know. We have guidelines. The committee has been working very hard on keeping the acoustic footprint of our area low. After all, it's a tranquility-designated zone." Tranquility. Another phrase. Another label. He wondered how many more of these floating codes governed things he didn't remember agreeing to. "Do you have a list of these guidelines?" he asked. Karen's smile twitched. "Of course, you'll get them in your next update packet. But in the meantime, just wanted to say, we're all watching out for each other, and we hope you'll make choices that reflect that." She turned, walked back down the gravel path, and disappeared between 2 symmetrical hedges. Jordan stood there, wondering if anyone else had ever been warned into compliance with a smile. The turbine remained silent, but the air around him had changed. He didn't sleep well that night, not out of fear, not even anger, but anticipation. He knew something was coming. He just didn't know how absurd, how sharp, how strange it would be. Yet, the following morning unfolded with a kind of deliberate normalcy that felt artificial, as though the world around Jordan had read a script and was now determined to perform it exactly as written. The sun filtered through the blinds with mechanical precision. The birds sounded suspiciously well-timed. Even the breeze seemed curated, as if to lull him into thinking the day would proceed without incident. He wasn't fooled. He knew manufactured calm always preceded something more pointed. At 9:12 a.m., a white utility van parked diagonally across the street. Not in front of any house in particular, just aligned enough with Jordan's lot to be noticed. 2 figures emerged, both dressed identically in ash-gray uniforms with reflective stripes that bore no logo, no name tag, no insignia. They carried what looked like surveying equipment, except they weren't surveying anything visible. Instead, they walked slowly up and down the sidewalk, pausing every few meters to tap on their tablets or glance skyward with the feigned casualness of people who didn't want to appear as though they were looking directly at something. Jordan watched from behind his kitchen window, not hiding but not presenting himself either. When one of them pointed briefly toward the corner of his roof, Jordan stepped outside. The taller of the two turned and offered a bland half-smile. "Good morning, sir. Routine infrastructure audit. No cause for concern." His voice had the cadence of someone who had practiced sounding harmless. Jordan raised an eyebrow. "Audit from who?" he asked, not aggressively, but with enough clarity to disrupt the performance. The man gestured vaguely toward the van. "We're contracted under Municipal Infrastructure Protocol. Airflow distribution, EM leakage, acoustic bleed." He rattled off terms like playing cards. Your property's been flagged for inconsistent atmospheric behavior during a localized outage event. Jordan didn't blink. What does that even mean? He asked. The man's companion spoke for the first time. There was an anomaly in directional pressure mapping. This street had a variance in passive sound absorption. You'll receive an explanatory brief within 48 hours. Jordan stared at them, silent. The taller one gave another practiced smile. No need to interfere. We'll be done shortly. Without another word, they resumed their slow, circling inspection, never stepping onto his lawn, never approaching his door. Jordan stood there another minute, watching. Then, without looking away, he reached into his hoodie pocket and clicked the remote trigger for the audio recorder embedded in the wall-mounted mailbox. He let the recording continue for the next 10 minutes before heading back inside. Later that day, when he replayed the sound file, he noticed that halfway through their inspection, the background hum of his wind turbine dropped off by 12 decibels for exactly 9 seconds, without the turbine itself ever stopping. It was a deliberate muting, not mechanical but environmental, as though the surrounding air had been muffled. That same afternoon, his municipal water stopped entirely. Not slowed, not trickled, stopped. When he called the service line, a cheerful voice told him there had been a digital record fault in the residential grid and that his property had inadvertently been removed from the active zone. It happens sometimes, the agent said. We're routing an auto repair team. You should see full flow within 72 hours. Jordan, unamused, asked for documentation of the fault. The voice on the other end became just a little less cheerful. I'm sorry, sir. That would require a data release authorization. When he requested to speak to a supervisor, he was placed on hold. The line never resumed. At 6:41 p.m., while replacing the charcoal in his filtration unit and mentally reviewing the language of the brief those surveyors had mentioned, he heard the now familiar rhythm of firm, fast steps on gravel. Karen was back. She didn't knock this time. She stood at the edge of his porch holding a pamphlet like a trophy. I thought you'd want to see this, she said brightly. It's the new Aesthetic Continuity Guide. Hot off the press. She handed it to him, and for a moment he didn't take it. The smile on her face was too eager, the kind of smile people wear when they think they're offering something benevolent while delivering something invasive. He took it without a word. Inside, he flipped through the document. On page 5, in small but unmistakable font, was a new clause under Acceptable Energy Augmentation Fixtures. Vertical wind turbines were now listed as conditionally compliant, subject to auditory footprint assessments by a designated civic, acoustician, and quarterly resonance checks via localized measurement agents. At the bottom was a clause stating that non-compliance or ambiguous classification may result in suspension of infrastructure privileges pending resolution. He looked at the date. It had been issued 2 days ago, before he even finished installing the turbine, before he knew they'd be watching. The next morning, his mailbox contained a neatly folded white envelope with no return address, only his name typed in a serif font. Inside was a glossy one-page document titled Pre-Compliance Consultation Invitation. It politely encouraged him to attend a resonance dialogue to discuss shared soundscapes and community harmony. The location was a temporary office inside a nearby business park, and the letter emphasized that preemptive collaboration would likely reduce administrative friction. It read like a peace offering, but Jordan had read too many contracts in his life to mistake politeness for goodwill. This was not de-escalation. It was strategic softening before another blow. He didn't attend. That same evening, a motion alert from one of his perimeter cameras pinged. Reviewing the footage, he saw a shadow pass along the side fence at 2:17 a.m., too fast and deliberate to be random. In the morning, he found a clear plastic cable tie wrapped around the protective shroud of his turbine's base. It wasn't attached to anything. It was just there, like a placeholder, or a warning. He photographed it, bagged it, and added it to the drawer now marked Record A Incidents. He also noticed something else. The turbine's resonance had shifted ever so slightly, and when he ran a frequency test on the new sound profile, he saw a faint but distinct harmonic echo matching a melody he hadn't thought about in years. The jingle used in the neighborhood's old welcome video, the same one that had been played when the previous head of the local council retired. It wasn't random. It was embedded in the wind. Jordan didn't believe in signs or fate or grand conspiracies, but he knew patterns. And this was a pattern, deliberate, organized, disguised as bureaucracy but laced with engineering. Someone was playing a long game, and if they thought he would fold under pressure, they had chosen the wrong house. He didn't retaliate. He didn't lash out. He installed 2 additional surge batteries, increased the shielding around the turbine, and wrote up a formal declaration of property-specific energy rights based on state-level microgeneration policy. He had it notarized, copied, and mailed it, certified to the address listed on the consultation invitation. It wasn't aggression, it was architecture. The wind would do the rest. By the time the 3rd envelope arrived, this one sealed with a sticker bearing the phrase Preliminary Enforcement Notification, Jordan's resolve had calcified into something not quite anger but far sharper than irritation. It wasn't personal yet, at least not in the traditional sense. The correspondence was still wrapped in polite euphemisms and procedural politeness. But the air had changed. The tone had shifted. This time, the letter listed the wind turbine itself by serial number, as if the system watching him had grown eyes, as if it had decided that general intimidation wasn't enough and now needed to identify, isolate, and pressure the object of their discomfort directly. The turbine, which until now had been a silent soldier of passive resistance, was officially named as a non-conforming vertical energy system pending further acoustic verification, and Jordan was given a 5-day window to present full resonance documentation. Attached was a brochure outlining a list of pre-approved inspectors and neutral parties, none of whom operated independently from the same office that had issued the first sound warning. The message was clear. If he wanted to prove his turbine wasn't illegal, he had to ask the very people accusing him of illegality to assess it. Instead, Jordan called in an independent firm from 2 counties over, one whose only listed clients were research labs and energy cooperatives, not residential communities or eco-integrated smart zones. He paid in full up front, told them nothing of his suspicions, and let the data speak for itself. The technician arrived with 2 full-size resonance plates, calibrated microphones, and a tablet that ran continuous frequency mapping. The test took 3 hours. The report arrived the next day. Not only was the turbine within all acceptable acoustic thresholds for private use, but the technician had added a footnote, half as a joke, stating, "You'd have to shove a clarinet into the intake for this thing to become even remotely musical." Jordan submitted the report, certified, notarized, archived. He did not include commentary, but he printed a copy for himself and framed it, hanging it beside the generator's maintenance log as a reminder that reason could still function, even in madness. For a day and a half, the neighborhood was quiet. No letters, no vans, no visits. He walked the perimeter of his property twice, watched the cameras, rechecked the turbine's sealants, ran silent diagnostics on every circuit in his workshop, and allowed himself, briefly, to believe that the worst might be over. It wasn't. 2 mornings later, someone left a parcel on his steps. No return address, no signature. Just a brown paper wrap and a printed label reading, Noise Harmony Device. Inside was a handheld decibel meter, crudely modified to emit a high-pitched buzz every time it detected noise above 30 decibels, which included bird chirps, shoe scuffs, and even the wind itself. Taped to the meter was a note that read, "Perhaps this will help you stay within our desired range." It was signed with a single initial. K. Jordan didn't laugh. He didn't rage. He bagged the device, placed it in his drawer beside the plastic cable tie and the envelope from the anonymous consultation office, and made his next call. Not to the energy firm, not to the inspector, but to a legal contact he hadn't spoken to in years. Miriam was not a litigator. She was an administrative strategist who specialized in the weaponization of local ordinances and how to defend against them. She'd once rewritten a land use clause to allow a retired welder to legally classify his barn as an acoustic study shed after a similar incident in another part of the state. When Jordan told her what was happening, she asked him 2 questions. "Have they touched your soil? And is your turbine registered as a permanent fixture or transportable unit?" The answer to both was not yet. That meant time, narrow, precious. Time, and she told him exactly what to do. Establish jurisdiction over the turbine as a structure rather than a device, file a boundary clarification with the county clerk to reaffirm fence-to-fence ownership, and submit a private sound inventory log for the previous 30 days to local records. Each move would bury the turbine under layers of bureaucratic armor. It wouldn't make him untouchable, but it would slow them down. That evening, Jordan made copies of every page of Miriam's guidance and spent 5 straight hours organizing digital and physical packets. When he drove to the clerk's office to submit the forms, he took the long way back, part instinct, part paranoia. His usual route passed through the newer part of the neighborhood, where the houses all looked alike, and the lawns all bore little signs with logos. That day, he noticed 3 new signs he'd never seen before. Sound-aware property, Harmony Network participant, and, most strangely, Rhythmic Accountability Zone. He stopped his car, rolled down the window, and listened. The street was silent, almost unnaturally so. He could hear his own heartbeat in the absence of ambient noise. It wasn't peaceful. It was surgical. The next morning, his turbine stopped. Not completely. It still turned, but the internal output had dropped by 68%. When he checked the diagnostics, the intake channels showed no blockage, no mechanical failure. But someone had tampered with the airflow regulators. When he examined them closely, he found tiny adhesive strips covering the microgills, barely visible unless you knew to look. Not sabotage exactly, just enough interference to reduce function and trigger a false maintenance-required notification. Whoever did it was subtle, intentional, and nearby. Jordan installed 2 more cameras, upgraded the infrared sensitivity, and began tracking vehicle movement on the street. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was confirmation. And when he compared footage over a 5-day window, he saw that the same dark blue sedan with no plates had parked across from his house at least 4 times for intervals of less than 10 minutes. Always after sunset. Always in silence. There were no lights inside the car, no movements, but the turbine's performance would dip within 30 minutes of each visit. He started logging the timings, comparing them to the neighborhood's official sound monitoring dispatch calendar. The overlap was precise. And on the 6th day, when the turbine's melody, still unintended, still barely audible, returned faintly on the upper frequency chart, he found that its pattern no longer resembled the original community jingle. Now it was inverted, almost mocking, bending familiar notes into dissonance. The turbine wasn't just a target now. It had become a symbol, not by his hand, but by theirs. And symbols attract attention. When the next envelope arrived, bright red this time, labeled Enforcement Phase 1, Immediate Review Recommended, Jordan didn't flinch. He opened it, read the boilerplate threats, the references to persistent acoustic deviance, and the offer to attend a special session at the Neighborhood Auditory Integration Forum, a location that didn't exist on any map. He didn't shred it. He scanned it, logged it, and forwarded it to Miriam. Her reply came within the hour. They've escalated. That was fast. Good, now we escalate faster. And so they would. The first sign that things were about to pivot came not from another letter, but from silence. Not the kind Jordan had grown used to. Artificial, imposed, weaponized, but a genuine stillness. The absence of pressure, of surveillance, of digital tremors in the air. For 3 full days, nothing arrived. No vehicles idling across the street, no reshuffled clauses slipped under the door, no veiled invitations to pseudo-legal meetings. The turbines resumed full function. The harmonic echo returned to neutrality, and even the motion alerts dropped to 0. At first, Jordan thought it was a regrouping maneuver, a tactical pause before the next round of pressure. But the silence dragged on, and it began to feel like something else. Abandonment. A tactical retreat, not due to failure, but perhaps redirection. On the 4th day, Miriam called instead of texting. Her tone was clipped, not panicked, but lined with urgency. "They're moving horizontally," she said. "Not through you, through your connections. Someone filed a petition to audit the ownership chain of the turbine's components. That means they're going after your suppliers. One of the firms you bought parts from? Their license is under review now for non-conforming energy dispersal hardware." Jordan didn't respond for a moment. "That's not just aggressive," he said slowly. "That's structural." Miriam agreed. "They're trying to make the source illegal so that your use becomes retroactively unlicensed. That way, you're guilty by extension, not intent." Jordan knew this tactic. It wasn't new. It was standard in bureaucratic warfare. Shift the battlefield until the target finds themselves surrounded by rules that didn't exist when they started. He asked Miriam if this changed their timeline. "Not unless you blink," she said. "So don't. This actually works in our favor. They've become traceable. Paper trails always leave residue." What she meant became clear the next day. An envelope arrived, but this time it wasn't anonymous or vaguely labeled. It was sent through official county mail, stamped and signed by a real person. Regional Compliance Officer Trevor Hanley. Inside was a copy of a report filed under Jordan's name, but not by Jordan. It accused him of constructing an amateur wind experiment, using sensitive harmonic tools unsuited for residential zones. The claim was absurd, but it was also oddly technical, filled with jargon only someone familiar with his equipment could fake. That was the point. It was meant to sound legitimate, to confuse, to overwhelm with pseudoscience. The signature at the bottom wasn't Hanley's. It belonged to someone named L. No last name, just an initial. Jordan stared at it for several seconds before realizing. It matched the writing from the first consultation note, the one that had invited him to a non-existent office. They had names now, or pieces of them, and that changed the balance. Jordan sent the forged report to Miriam. Hours later, she emailed back 3 separate case numbers from other towns. Different names, different equipment, same tactic. In each, the energy source had been framed as dangerous through manipulated paperwork, leading to forced removal and fines. But in one case, the homeowner had fought back, not alone. Through a civilian oversight committee tied to a watchdog firm in Portland that specialized in auditing municipal overreach. Jordan reached out. He didn't expect an answer quickly. He received one in less than 6 hours. The woman who responded introduced herself as Ava. She didn't explain her job title, didn't overintroduce, didn't ask unnecessary questions. She just wrote, "We've seen your documents. You're not paranoid. You're caught in a testbed zone. You're not the only one. Give me 2 days." Jordan waited. For the first time since the turbine had gone up, he didn't tinker. He didn't monitor. He watched. And during those 2 days, he noticed something subtle, a shift in the neighborhood's energy. More signs began appearing, but they weren't new slogans. They were retractions. Placards that once read "Sound Harmony Certified" were removed. 2 houses stopped illuminating their compliance-linked porch lights. A man he'd never spoken to, a young father from 3 doors down, nodded to him while taking out the trash. Just once. Just enough. On the second evening, Eva sent him a file, encrypted, clean. Inside was a map, not of his neighborhood, but of 15 others, all marked as pilot communities for what the internal documents called Sound Conscious Autonomous Zones. The language in the files was pure corporate theater, phrases like community harmonization, auditory minimalism, resonant identity, cohesion. But the subtext was clear. These were control zones, built not through law, but through suggestion, conditioning, and pressure. And Jordan's address, marked in bold with a note. Anchor participant. Response testing in progress. They weren't just trying to shut him down, they were studying him. He sat in silence for a long time, the turbine humming softly in the distance. When it caught the wind just right, the familiar melodic arc emerged again. Not loud, not insistent, but unmistakable. The song they'd tried to silence. The anthem they had built, then buried, then restructured into a warning. Jordan stood, walked to the breaker, and shut down the lights. Then he opened every window, let the night air fill the house, and listened. Not to the melody, but to what had surrounded it for weeks. Fear, manipulation, control disguised as care. He wasn't fighting sound. He was fighting an algorithm with boots on the ground. And it was listening too. The break didn't last. Whatever lull had temporarily suspended the machinery around him was not a truce, but a recalibration. The silence had never been surrender, it had been a pivot. Jordan woke on the 7th morning of that strange, suspended calm to find every file in his neighborhood access account marked pending validation. At first he thought it was a technical error, maybe a maintenance window or a data migration. But when? He tried logging in to submit a permit request for a routine delivery at the gate. The system rejected his credentials. When he contacted the support line, he was informed that his account had been flagged for unverified acoustic compliance data inconsistencies. That phrase, so precise, so mechanical, didn't even attempt to sound neutral anymore. It wasn't a glitch. It was a revocation. Without credentials, he couldn't open his side gate. He couldn't receive packages. His service access was frozen. He hadn't even received a notice this time. The system had simply acted. He documented everything. Time-stamped screenshots, audio logs of phone calls, even the error codes returned by the access panel. Miriam confirmed what he already suspected. This was an internal freeze initiated by the neighborhood's digital infrastructure partner. Not the committee, not any human being, but the service algorithm itself. That's what happens, she said, when a digital environment is fed conflicting directives with no override. He asked her if it was legal. No, she replied, but it's programmable, and in these systems that's more powerful than legal. By the end of the day, 2 more abnormalities surfaced. First, a letter appeared in his physical mailbox, not from the usual vague counsel but from a corporate entity he'd never seen before, Resonance Solutions Group, a private firm headquartered 2 states away. The letter stated that his residence had been selected for phase alignment testing, based on his unique waveform profile, whatever that meant. It went on to explain that in order to maintain community consistency and optimize the broader auditory environment, a temporary acoustic evaluation beacon would be installed near the western boundary of his property. The language was sanitized and cheerful, describing the device as compact, passive, and non-invasive, and concluding with the phrase, "Thank you for being a Harmony neighbor." Jordan set the letter down and immediately walked to the west side. of the yard. And there it was. He hadn't noticed it during his morning check, no doubt installed in those twilight hours when interference disguises activity. A small white cylinder no taller than a shoebox, planted firmly into the soil near the fence line, disguised as a utility marker. Except it wasn't. When he examined it, he saw a faint digital pulse emit from a vented side panel every few seconds, barely visible unless you were looking for it. He pulled out a frequency reader and measured the signal. 2.78 kilohertz, consistent, synchronized, precisely modulated. It wasn't recording. It was broadcasting. He disabled it immediately, not by force but by accessing its exposed maintenance port and draining its onboard cache to a portable reader. Inside was a log, time-coded emissions linked to wind fluctuations. It had been reacting to the turbine's pitch. The second event that day was more direct. At 10:18 p.m., a car approached his driveway and parked. Not the plateless sedan from before. This one bore municipal contractor markings. A woman stepped out, mid-30s, dark coat, clipboard. She didn't approach the door. Instead, she placed something on the ground by his front steps and walked away. When she was gone, Jordan retrieved it. It was a small square speaker, the kind used for public address systems. Attached to it was a cable and a laminated card reading, "Scheduled Resonance Verification Playback." On instinct, he connected it to his isolated inverter rather than the main line, careful to avoid feeding it into his system. It powered up immediately and began emitting a low, pulsating tone, barely audible but deep enough to vibrate through the floorboards. He recorded the sound, reversed it, analyzed its waveform, and cross-referenced it with the melody previously emitted by his turbine. It wasn't a test. It was a counter-frequency. A sound engineered to neutralize the harmonic signature of his device, not through destruction, through cancellation. The turbine's unique pitch was being erased from the ambient environment, one pulse at a time. He unplugged the device and stored it in his basement, wrapping it in a soundproofing cloth. His house was no longer a residence. It was becoming a battleground for the control of vibration. The following morning, he walked into town. It was something he hadn't done in weeks. He needed to see if the war he was fighting had begun to show signs beyond the borders of his own lot. And it had. He passed 4 homes now bearing the Harmony logo, not just on signs, but etched into glass, molded into fences, printed on mailboxes. He passed another with every window blacked out with mirrored film. One house had a camera dome installed at each corner of the roof, all blinking in unison. It was no longer just him. The entire zone had begun to mutate. Neighbors looked away when he passed. One man, watering his lawn, turned the hose off mid-spray just to pretend he wasn't there. It was beyond social now. It was atmospheric. Everyone could feel it. No one wanted to acknowledge it. That night, Jordan held a conference call with Miriam and Eva. They had invited a third participant, a man from an urban tech law nonprofit who specialized in modular surveillance deployment. He confirmed what they suspected. Your property is a part of a resonance experiment funded through an urban planning grant, he said. They're testing behavioral modulation through environmental sound. You're not the problem. Your turbine is. Because it created a variable they can't regulate without hard force, and that makes it a threat. He paused. This goes beyond your property, but you're the first person to respond with structure instead of rage. That's why they're escalating. Jordan asked if this was a fight he could win. Not directly, the man answered. But if you hold your line and we make enough of it visible, they might pull out before exposure becomes liability. And then another blow. At 3:12 a.m., every external camera on Jordan's property blinked out simultaneously. Not broken, blinded. A synchronized white flash across each lens, burning out the capture but leaving the audio intact. He listened to the audio feeds and heard Nothing. Absolute silence. Then a door creaked. Not his neighbor's. A soft whine of hinges, followed by 3 soft knocks, and then again 3 more. The knock pattern repeated on another property 4 houses down. Someone was going door to door, but not knocking in the usual sense. It was a code. The pattern, 3-3, 3-3, pause, 2. He noted the time, the sequence, and the direction. By the time he stepped outside, there was no one in sight, but taped to the mailbox was another laminated card. No sound device this time, just words. If the wind changes, remember which way it blew first. It wasn't a threat, it was a message, and it wasn't from them. The next day, the wind shifted, not metaphorically, literally. The entire week had seen winds coming from the west, feeding the turbine perfectly, but now they came from the east, something that rarely happened during that season. The turbine's pitch shifted, and then, in a strange alignment Jordan couldn't have planned, the blades emitted a single elongated note, one that didn't resemble any known song or jingle but pierced through the stillness with a clarity that no algorithm could cancel. And in 3 houses nearby, lights blinked on at the exact same time. Not in protest, not in confusion, but as if responding to a cue. Jordan smiled, barely. He didn't know what was coming next, but he knew this much. He wasn't playing solo anymore. And the wind was starting to turn. It began with the wrong sound at the right time. A single burst of static, sharp and intrusive, cutting through the air like a shiver against skin, ruptured the low, predictable hum of the morning. Jordan had been running a diagnostic sweep through the turbine's memory buffer when the interference hit. A glitch, short and crude, not part of the usual pattern. It wasn't local. The source didn't trace to anything he controlled. That was the first real warning. The second came 20 minutes later when he found the digital control panel for the power relay grid inside his workshop completely wiped. Factory reset, as if it had never been configured at all. His login credentials rejected, his logs scrubbed. It didn't take long to realize the breach hadn't come from the outside. It had been executed through a cached admin access token embedded into a firmware update packet delivered 4 days ago, one he hadn't installed manually. That meant the override came from the infrastructure management system itself. They had escalated, not by pressure but by erasure. And now they weren't just trying to monitor him, they were actively reclaiming the space. Miriam, already alert to the change, called just as he finished isolating the token signature. Her voice was sharper now, stripped of the careful composure she usually maintained. They're filing for a preemptive property reclassification under Environmental Disruption Protocol. It's not about noise anymore. They're calling your turbine an invasive environmental actuator. They want the right to inspect it under ecological stabilization law. Jordan froze for a moment, not in panic, but in realization. This wasn't targeting behavior. This was removal preparation. How much time? He asked. 2 days before the motion is logged into the regional system, she answered. But that won't matter if they execute the on-site inspection without warning. Okay, they're requesting an emergency override based on safety pretext. The phrase sounded clean, sterile, and precise. A tool of policy wielded like a scalpel. Jordan didn't argue. He just nodded, set down the call, and activated every failsafe embedded in the turbine's internal stack. If they were coming, they'd come under a full record. The next morning, the team arrived without ceremony. 4 individuals in marked utility vehicles dressed in generic maintenance gear, their movements too deliberate, too organized to pass as routine. Jordan watched them from the kitchen, unmoving. One of them knocked, politely. Another took photographs. The third unloaded a device with protruding antennae that pulsed in irregular beats as it scanned his front lawn. The fourth placed a plastic panel near the base of the turbine, where it clicked into place with a quiet magnetic seal. Jordan opened the door. "Inspection requires consent," he said flatly. The lead technician nodded, not denying it. "This is a pre-assessment for environmental stabilization. You can deny access, but the review proceeds with available data." Jordan took a slow breath. "Then proceed from the curb. Do not enter my boundary line." The man didn't argue. He simply made a note on his tablet and stepped back. It was theater. The real assessment had already happened. 3 hours later, as they drove away, Jordan noticed something new. The turbine, still spinning, still silent to the untrained ear, now emitted a subtle, layered echo, a delayed harmonic sequence that didn't align with its usual resonance. At first, he thought it was interference from the external panel, but when he checked the source logs, he saw the anomaly didn't originate from his system. It was atmospheric. The turbine was responding not to sabotage, but to a saturation event, a wave of ambient noise compression radiating from a nearby relay. Someone had activated a field to mute him. That night, the neighborhood pulsed with artificial quiet. Dogs didn't bark. Not a single car alarm chirped. Streetlights dimmed uniformly, not by failure, but by modulation. The soundscape had been artificially flattened. Jordan stood outside, listening. No melody, no static, just dead air. A manufactured calm, stretched across real life like a tarp over a body. And then, through that stillness, a sound not meant to be there emerged. Not from his turbine. From across the street. 3 notes, short, identical, spaced exactly 5 seconds apart, played from a second-story window. He recognized the sequence, the same frequency pattern his turbine had once emitted by accident. But now it was played deliberately. Someone else was transmitting. The following day, 2 more houses joined. Not loudly, not in defiance, but subtly. Almost inaudible chimes, carried on modified resonance plates hidden behind decorative vents. A third house switched its porch light to blink in timed intervals, mimicking the pulses from the turbine's earlier days. Jordan said nothing. He didn't organize them, he didn't instruct or lead, but the signal had spread, and with it, the illusion of control began to fracture. Miriam confirmed that internal compliance metrics had begun to shift. "They're losing the zone," she said. Once coordination breaks, the legitimacy of any systemic enforcement collapses. They'll try something desperate now, something messy. And they did. The emergency motion passed at 9:04 a.m., but not as an inspection, as an order. Mandatory deactivation directive. Environmental synchronization violation. Jordan had 24 hours to disable and remove the turbine or face enforced reclamation. That night, the trucks returned, not unmarked this time, but clearly designated with the insignia of the Environmental Stabilization Unit, escorted by a single municipal enforcement officer. It wasn't legal, not entirely, but it was enough to intimidate. They knocked. Jordan answered. Behind him, the turbine hummed steadily. The officer read the order. Jordan asked if he had the right to appeal. The officer nodded. But not today. And then something shifted. Not in the sky, not on the street, but inside the system. One of the houses, the one with the chimes, activated a perimeter jammer. Not strong, not disruptive, but loud enough to corrupt the scanners. The device used by the technician began misreading every signal. Another house turned on high-powered lights, overloading the visual scanners. A third activated an automated lawn system that doused the team's staging area with water, citing a scheduled irrigation window. Jordan watched as the entire enforcement effort began to falter. Not violently, not chaotically, just enough resistance, everywhere, to confuse the algorithm. The team withdrew temporarily, stating they would return with recalibrated instruments. But they never returned. That night, the turbine sang again, not with defiance, not with anger, but with clarity. A sound that didn't just cut through the quiet, but redefined it. Jordan stood alone on his porch, not as a rebel, not as a hero, but as a man who hadn't flinched. And now the wind, it seemed, was firmly on his side. The days that followed unfolded not with triumph, but with exhaustion. The battle had not been one of blood or banners, but of attrition, of erosion and resistance measured not in victories, but in the absence of further intrusion. The trucks didn't return, and the notices ceased. The mailbox, once a daily source of passive-aggressive commands wrapped in bureaucratic civility, remained empty. The neighborhood, which had once pulsed with tension so thick it shaped conversations and redirected eye contact, began to loosen its shoulders. Jordan didn't celebrate. He didn't announce anything. He didn't remove the turbine. It stayed, spinning silently, as it always had, not as a monument or defiance, but as a continuation, proof that something could remain unbent if you simply refused to let it be dismantled. He filed no lawsuits, no countersuits. Miriam advised against it, and he agreed. The objective had never been revenge. It had been to stop the erosion of space, of silence, of autonomy disguised as a participation. Ava followed up once, confirming that 3 separate corporate entities had quietly withdrawn funding from the Sound Control Initiative, likely in response to mounting internal conflict and reputational exposure. There were whispers of redirection, of the next test bed moving to a more controllable area. The experiment wasn't dead, just migrating, but Jordan knew that wasn't his war anymore. He had drawn his line and held it. Let someone else write the next chapter. Around him, the signals of change remained, faint but undeniable. The houses that had once blinked in unison now pulsed irregularly or not at all. The Harmony Network signs disappeared almost overnight, as if someone had swept the neighborhood of its branding in a single coordinated act of dissociation. Some neighbors returned to their old routines, others became more withdrawn. A few, those who had chimed in, lit up, or disrupted the final enforcement night, offered brief nods when passing. No words, just a flicker of recognition, not of friendship, but of shared memory. Karen never returned. Her house remained meticulously maintained, the same floral patterns in the window, the same symmetrical hedges, but she was never seen outside again. Whether she had been a true believer or simply a vector for the system, Jordan no longer cared. She had played her role. The sound of her voice, once a trigger, now faded into the background of things that no longer mattered. The turbine, despite everything, never malfunctioned again. The interference faded. The harmonics stabilized. When Jordan sat in the workshop, now free from passive surveillance and environmental obfuscation, he could hear the clean tone of its rotation whenever the wind swept in from the hills. It had become more than a machine. Not a symbol, exactly, but something living in the way a melody becomes a part of a place. He left the frequency reader connected at all times, not for safety, but as a habit of presence. 1 week later, he received a letter, not in warning, but in inquiry. A nearby school, public, underfunded, but still standing, had heard of his wind turbine through someone on the County Energy Advisory Board. They asked if he might be willing to speak to students about non-standard energy solutions and the value of design integrity. He didn't laugh, didn't scoff. He read the letter twice and set it on the workbench. Then he looked at the turbine, turning slowly, steady as ever. He didn't reply immediately, but when he did, it was with a simple note. "I'll bring a sound map and a story. Let the wind do the rest." And so it did.